I'm 16 years old, a little older than you are, because for me that is the time that the Second World War started. You know, of course, from your history class that the Second World War started on the 1st of September when Hitler's army moved into Poland, and England and later France both declared war on Germany. And then we had a period of time which was called the phony war, when nothing happened. It was all maybe from November 1939 till about the end of March 1940. And in the beginning of March, the German armies moved into Denmark and they moved into Norway. I was born on the 8th of May, so on the 10th of May, that's the day that the Germans moved into Holland, I was 16 years old. The night before, on the 9th, we had been invited by the Alumni Association of the high school that I attended to come to a theater in town where they put on a play. And that was on Thursday night. The senior class was invited, and we were there till about 11 o'clock at night, and then we either walked or took the streetcar home and went to bed. A couple of hours later we woke up thinking there was a thunderstorm, but it was not a thunderstorm. That was the first time that we heard anti-aircraft guns firing, because without a warning, without declaring war, Hitler had sent his air force and his armies into Holland. Now Holland is only a small country, it isn't any bigger than New Jersey, and at that time it had only about 13 million people, while Germany had something like 80 million people, so it certainly was not a contest. But Hitler was very much surprised that we held him off for 5 days. He had dropped a lot of paratroops in all over the country, and they tried to secure the Air Force, the airfields, so they could land their own planes. But that didn't always work. And on all the big bridges, the bridge over the River Maas, and you've maybe heard it, I've seen it on the map, what they call the Afsluitdijk. That's the dike that created IJsselmeer, which used to be the Zuiderzee. They never came across there. For 5 days, this little Dutch army held off the might of the German army. And Hitler got so mad at that he gave orders that the city of Rotterdam should be destroyed. Now the commander of the Marines in Rotterdam surrendered the city to the German commander, and the German commander, thinking that that would hold off the airplanes, fired a Very pistol and gave signals for the planes to turn back. But they didn't turn back. The only thing that happened is that the anti-aircraft guns stopped firing, so they could come down to a level of about 1,000 feet and bomb the city. They threw all their bombs in the big streets and big avenues so they could break up the water mains and the gas mains, so any fires that started could not be put out. And that's exactly what happened. I have some pictures with me here. This is in the center of the city. This is the church that is there as it looked before the bombardment, and this is what the center of the city looked like after the bombardment. So you can show these around, okay? These are some more pictures. This is a very famous restaurant in Rotterdam before and after the bombardment. The bombardment itself was not so terribly severe, but the fact was they put the city on fire, and it burned for about 3 weeks. So the number of dead was not as high as we thought. We thought there would be about 12,000 dead, but after the war we found out that it was closer to 1,200. But there were 70 or 80,000 people out of home. Everything burned. I think something like 70 churches and 40 movie theaters and all kinds of buildings. They burned, and they took them 5 years to clear all the rubble in the city. And now they have been rebuilding it. I've been there recently. I was there in August and September and October, and it is a very, very modern, new big city, and I hate it. I worked for 27 years in New York City. I don't like big cities, but many people think it's nice. I don't, but that's different. So I was 16 years old when that happened, and because I wasn't quite a child anymore, but some of the children were, in August, were allowed to go to small villages in the country to rest up, because there was quite a lot of bombing going on in these first couple of months. But I started to talk about my high school exam. The exams were scheduled for May, and of course that couldn't happen on account of the war, so they were postponed till June. And the government decided that they would not do away with the exams. When you graduate high school in Holland, the government appoints examiners. These are not your teachers. You've never seen these people before, so it's very independent. And you have to write 1 or 2 days of written exams and 1 or 2 days of oral exams. My memory failed me to find out which is which. I have an idea that the oral is 1 day and that the written was 2 days. But while we were writing these exams, the British were bombing the harbor at the same time, so it was a bit difficult. The reason that they did not do away with these exams was because to protect us. They said, if later in your life, if you come with a diploma of 1940 and you had been given this diploma without an exam, your employer would say, well, this isn't worth anything. In 1940 they gave them away. So we wrote our exams. So I started working in September. I started working right after high school. And there was a very good reason for that, because everybody or anybody who didn't have work, any male person, would be sent to Germany for work in the munitions factories. So I couldn't find work, and a friend of my father said, well, you can come work for me, but I haven't got any money, so if you want to, you can come and work for nothing. So, right? So I worked 5.5 days a week in an office for nothing. But the labor office said that that didn't count. That was not a job. You have to have pay. So he finally agreed to pay me something like $2.50 a week. So I earned $2.50 a week for 5.5 days work. So if any of you ever complain about your little amount of money that you make when you have to babysit, then think about that. Then in December, I got a job at the Social Security office. And percentage-wise, I got the biggest raise in my life. From 2.5, I jumped to $5.88 for 5.5 days of work. That was pretty good. Now, I worked for these people until May 1942, so that's a year and a half. But then I was 18 years old, and in order to get a permanent appointment, the Germans had required that all people who worked in government offices come and put in 2 years service in uniformed service in the German army to do construction work, and that I was not going to do. So I had only 2 choices. I either could go in hiding or I could find another job. Now, going in hiding was a bit difficult for me because I really didn't have enough connections or people to help me. But somebody we knew was the assistant purchasing agent in one of the largest shipyards near Rotterdam, and he offered me a job. He said he was the assistant purchasing agent, and his boss was 59 years old, so in 6 years he was going to retire, and we all hoped that the war would be over by then. And if I let him train me, then I would be the assistant purchasing agent on a 6,500-man shipyard, and at age 21, 22, that was a pretty good prospect. So I went there, because now you can say that we were working for the Germans, but practically everybody else was working for the Germans because they had taken over the country. All industry, everything that you did was controlled by the German army. One of the results was that, which I didn't know at that time because it hadn't happened yet, it became the focus of the American and the British Air Force. It was the most bombed shipyard in the Netherlands. So in the 2.5 or 3 years that I worked there, I went through approximately 25 to 30 aerial bombardments, plus the bombardments that were going on in the city and the harbors. And things like that really put a an entire different coloring on your life. What we went through in our teen years have stayed with us, have stayed with me the rest of my life. It really puts a stamp on your life. And I think that that is true not only in wartime, but it's also true in peacetime. The things that you do when you are a teenager are the things that are going to stay with you the rest of your life. Now let me see. Sometimes the Germans would threaten with a raid or pick up people. I had, for instance, because I worked for this shipyard, I had a pass that said that I should not be arrested because I was working in the defense industry. Many a time this pass kept me out of the hands of the police and of the soldiers. Whenever you were on the train or on the streetcar, they would stop you and ask for your ID, which of course is this thing, which you also had to have. This was a civilian ID. See? With your picture and your fingerprint. I think it's a thumbprint, doesn't make any difference. And the Nazi stamps on there, so you can pass that around if you want to see it. But I had this pass, and that kept me out of the hands of the Germans for quite a long time. It must have been the second one that I have, because this one is issued on December the 2nd, 1943, and I know for sure that I already had something like that in 1942. But maybe they changed the requirements at that time. Sometimes there were threats, though, of a raid, and if you heard about it, you better stay off the street or go into hiding. Now, I had an uncle who was my mother's oldest brother. He was an officer of the court, and he got so mentally hurt by all the irregularities that were going on at court that he got mentally ill, and he died. I believe he died of a broken heart. He died in an institution. And she started to hate the Germans so much that she decided to spend the rest of her life and all her resources, which were considerable, to helping people. So in February 1943, there was a threat that the Germans would give a raid in Holland, in Rotterdam, and pick up a lot of young men. So I went to my aunt's house, and she put me in a little room, which I was not allowed to leave unless she was in the house and give me permission to use the bathroom. And I was not allowed to make any noise, particularly when she was not there. And what I found out later, after the war, that I was not the only one in that house. There was a Jewish couple there that she was hiding, and they became such close friends that later on they became part of our family. We called them uncle and aunt. So they didn't know I was there, and I didn't know that they were there. And she also had a German officer quartered in her house, and he didn't know that we were there. So she really knew how to juggle things. That was a tough time. But fortunately, after a week, the danger went away, and I could come out again. And then I worked during the summer. And as I told you, I worked for the Social Security office, so I knew a little more about the Social Security laws than most people. Here, your employer deducts premium from your salary and then pays an equal amount to the government, and they pay that into a bank account. In Holland, what they do, or what they did, and after all this is 50 years ago, everybody had a card, which was about this big, and your employer would buy stamps, like you buy postage stamps, but these were labor stamps. They were Social Security stamps. So for every week that you work, you got a stamp in your book, and when you had worked the whole year, you had a full book of stamps, which meant that all your premiums were paid because your employer had bought these stamps. But you also needed that card, and you needed your ID, your food rations, and your clothing rations, because everything was rationed. Clothing, shoes, food, everything. And I got a report. Let me see what I did with it. In 1943, in September, that we had to come to the labor office and bring our social security card with us. Well, I said to myself, no, that can only mean they're going to take them away. And if they take them away, you can't get any food stamps. So what they're going to do is they're going to ship you off to Germany to work in a munitions factory. So I called my girlfriend and said, let's go to this place and see what happens. And I waited outside, and sure enough, the other guys who had gone there, they came out and they said, yes, Monday we have to go to Bremen in Germany. So I walked in the front door as if I was going to report myself and didn't talk to anybody, and I walked out the back door and I went home with her. She lived in another city where I also had a friend, and his mother put me up for a couple of weeks. So I was in hiding for the second time, and then it lasted 3 weeks. By that time, the shipyard had gotten permission for all those people who worked there that they could come back to work and did not have to go to Germany. So I got a card from them that I could come back and didn't have to hide anymore. But I still wanted to use this pass. So my father was in the underground. And what they did, they wrote on the back that this pass was extended for an indefinite period of time, and they put a German stamp next to it with a signature. So now all of a sudden I had a pass that would last me for as long as I could use it, which I was pretty happy with. And I used that again for a whole year. It was issued in December until November 1944, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Working in a shipyard that is under fairly frequent aerial bombardment is something that is not altogether easy. We had air raid shelters, which were not all that good. There was a large bunker built near the entrance, and that was a very heavy concrete bunker. And the Germans had built little concrete bunkers for themselves, and they were like tubes, flat at the bottom, round at the top, with 2 entrances, without doors, so that if a bomb exploded, the air would just go through it and nobody would get hurt. And if the bomb was very close, they would roll over instead of breaking. Now, the German officers who worked on the shipyard and whom we got to know fairly well, they didn't mind that we sat in those things. But sometimes there was a minesweeper or another warship, and when the Allies came to bomb, these guys would run off that ship and take out their pistols and chase us out of the air raid shelter, so we had to fend for ourselves in the open. And eventually that became very uncomfortable, because by then the B-17s had been outfitted with belly cannons, and a belly cannon is a little more uncomfortable than a bomb. In the first place, you can't see it, and bombs you can see coming. It's something that you learn in wartime. The airplanes always came from a certain direction, so that they would have the least chance of damaging any of the civilian population. So as they come here, and if you see them, then you run like this, because that's the quickest way to get away from them. If you run with them, they catch you. So you run towards them, and then at the same time, you can keep your eye on the planes, and when you see the bomb bays open, you know that in a second or two they're going to drop their bombs, and it takes 4 or 5 seconds for those bombs to reach the ground, so you can lie down and try to get some protection. But when they shoot belly cannon, that's like a machine gun, only the bullets explode. They're about this big, and they explode, and that's uncomfortable. Some people died. We didn't lose too many people, fortunately. In one bombardment, was in 1943, March the 4th. We lost about 20 people. And these things happen. There's one thing I learned, and I told also the other classes, that you become aware of the fact that if you leave your house, or when you leave your house, you're never sure whether you're going to come back or not, because the possibility of dying was a very real possibility. So I have always made it a rule, and with my wife also, we've always made it a rule that no matter what happens, if we have an argument sometimes, we never leave the house until that's resolved. Because maybe you leave the house and you never come back. And then the people that you love most, the last memory they have of you is that you had an argument. And that's a very good rule to live by, also with your parents and your brothers and sisters and boyfriends and girlfriends and whatever you have. Whenever you have an argument in the house, whenever you have difficulties, don't go away until it is resolved, because even in this modern time, you never know whether you're going to get back. That's a good rule to live by. Now there are many things that happen, and I have to pick and choose in the stories that I'm going to tell you. 1944, who of you have read the book A Bridge Too Far? No? Good book to read. It's a decision of Field Marshal Montgomery that they were going to try to catch all the bridges over the big rivers in Holland in one fell swoop. And the last one was the bridge at Arnhem. And that was attacked by American and British, mostly British and Polish paratroopers. What they did not know was that the German army had pulled a couple of brigades of tanks off the front line to rest up. And the Dutch underground, a boy had found these tanks, they had seen them, and the Dutch underground had sent word to London that these tanks were there. And they didn't believe them. They didn't believe them. And the attack went on anyway. And it was a great disaster. That bridge was not taken. And it cost about, I think it cost about 10,000 lives, something like that. Funny part is that since you cannot look into the future, I was there about 6 weeks, 7 weeks I think, before that attack took place. We were on vacation, my girl and I were on vacation. She stayed with one family and I stayed with another family, and we spent the days together walking and going to museums and things like that. And somehow, for one reason or another, we got off the road. We wanted to walk in the woods, and I cannot imagine why those fences were broken or why those fences were open, because there was nobody in those woods. It was so quiet, and we wondered already why we didn't meet anybody. So when we walked through there and we came out of it, we saw a huge big billboard, but the letters were on the other side. So we walked under it and turned around, and then we found out, well, we hadn't seen anybody. We had walked through a minefield. So
oh, look at the draw.
yeah, it was very good we didn't sit down. You go off with a bang, you know. Well, it also gave me an idea, which has stayed with me all my life, that having gone through these bombardments and having gone through these minefields and so on, that the Lord had something for me to do in my life, and that I better find out what that was, and that I do it. Because so many times I have been in danger of being killed, and I didn't get killed, and that was a message for me to make good and proper use of my life. And that is also something that when you're a young person, it's good to think about. Now, when that air raid took place, a week before that, or a few weeks before that, the Dutch government in London issued an order to the railroads to go on strike, so that the Germans couldn't use the railroads to transport troops and materiel. And by and large, they obeyed that. The entire railroad system was down, which also meant, of course, that I couldn't visit my girl because she lived in The Hague and I lived in Rotterdam. So I hadn't seen her from September to the beginning of November, and I decided that I was going to see her, and I walked from there. That's about 20 miles. But the last, well, I wouldn't say the last half, but certainly the last third of the trip, I could find a streetcar that carried me, so I didn't have to walk all the way. And I saw her for 20 minutes, and then I walked back home again. So I had walked all day long to see my girl for 20 minutes. We've been together 53 years now, so I think it's stuck. Anyway, I noticed some German troop movements when I came back that night of the 9th of November. And the next day I found out why. The Germans had surrounded the city of Rotterdam with about 30,000 troops. And they issued orders that all men between the ages of 17 and 40 had to come and stand in front of their house, take enough clothing and food and shoes with them for a couple of days, and they would be taken to Germany to work in the defense industry there. They gave you advice on what to do, and they made all kinds of promises that you would get good food and you would be paid and so on. Of course, that's not all true. But the most important line is at the bottom, and that's why they put it in large print. And it says, anybody who resists or tries to escape will be shot. No questions asked. That was the rule. You didn't do what they said, you get shot. They had done that many times already, because right from the beginning they arrested well-known people in Holland. Professors, doctors, members of the government, ministers, and they kept them as hostages. And when the underground would say blow up a bridge or blow up a railroad viaduct, they would take 15 of these people and shoot them and put their names in the paper and tell them that's what we have done with them, so you better behave, otherwise we'll do it again. They were very quick with their guns. They killed many, many people. They had, if you have read in Corrie ten Boom's book, her old father, he died before they got to the concentration camps, and these things happened. My wife's minister got shot because ministers and priests, they preached against the Germans, against the brutality and against the lawlessness. And they were taken and put in concentration camps. Two of my ministers spent years in concentration camps. Her minister got shot, as were many others. Now, when this happened, I decided that after having stayed out of the Germans' hands for 4 years, I was not going to stand in front of my house like a sheep and be picked up. So we put the blackout on, which is on the window, so there is no light, and we unscrewed the light bulbs in the lower part of the house, which was like you have with a two-level house here, split-level house, that you have the sleeping quarters lower, and we did that too. So it was dark. I had my suitcase ready, and I figured in case they come and pick me up, at least I didn't go stand like a dummy in front of my own house. And for months already, my father and mother had put up two guys who were also hiding from the Germans. And when the German soldiers walked into the front door, they jumped out the back door and climbed over the fences and went into the rooms or in the homes of the people where the Germans had been already. And this is funny because a friend of ours lived there, and she had an old mother. She must have been 90 years old. Was lying in bed, and one of the boys who lived with us, he scooted under her bed, and she called her daughter. She said, "Lena, there's a man under my bed." She said, "No, mother, there is no man under your bed." "Yes, there is a man under my bed." "No, mother, go to sleep. There is no man under your bed." Of course, there was a man under her bed. She was right, you know. So later in the day, these boys came back, and we made arrangements that they went into the country and stayed with other people. I stayed home. But I got a little bit, I would call it stir crazy. Here you would say you get cabin fever, you know, when you get locked up too long, because I couldn't get out of the house. If I was out of the house, I got picked up. So, and another result of this railroad strike was that we didn't have any food. The American Army and the Canadian Army had already gone through the eastern part of Holland and were into Germany, and we were cut off. That was after these 55,000 men were taken to Germany. So what we refer to as the hunger winter started. We had no food, we had no electricity, no heat, no gas, a little bit of water because there was no pressure, so only the lower apartments had water. Then I got a bit of stir crazy, so I said to my mother, tomorrow I'm going to visit my aunt, your sister. Since we had curfew from 6 to 6, and Holland is at a higher latitude than we are here, it's dark at 6 o'clock in the morning and it's dark at 6 o'clock at night. But in the house where we lived, on the second floor, lived a group of young people. 2 sisters and 3 brothers. They had lost their parents before the war already, and they lived there together. And they were a unit of the underground, and they had radio contact with London. And those radios, we had sunk into the floor. We had, of course, closets in the wall, so they built platforms in the closet, opened the floor of the upper apartment, and sunk the radios in the top of these closets. That one day that I wasn't home, I was gone. I was home already for 2 months, and that one day that I wasn't home, the Germans raided the house and everybody got arrested. So that's what I said to you earlier. I have been saved many times in many different ways, and that really put a stamp on my life. I was coming back at night, and about a mile away from home, I saw a guy standing on the street corner with what I thought was a bicycle pump. And I didn't realize that it was not a bicycle pump, it was a Sten gun. And I was just past him, I met a German officer, and behind the German officer, about 10 paces behind him, is a civilian who walks there, and I'm past both these guys. And all of a sudden a firefight breaks out, because this fellow was one of a group who were trying to liberate those boys who had been taken in my house, which I didn't know about, and they tried to get him back out of the German hands. And the German officer got so flustered that he pulls his pistol, he turns around and he shoots the guy who walks behind him, who had nothing to do with it, and he shot him dead. Luckily, fortunately, whatever words you want to use, I was just a block further. So, again, I got away. But it became very dangerous then after that raid. I couldn't stay home anymore, so I went to hide in a home for senior citizens, people who were really very old and sick. And the owners of that house, they put me up with 2 other guys, and we worked there, we cleaned and we cooked and we did the dishes and we did all kinds of things that had to be done. And we had electricity, because the house on the right-hand side was a German headquarters, and the house on the left-hand side was a Nazi headquarters, and the cables ran through our house. So we had electricity, we had heat. No, not heat, we had light, which not many people had. It was very difficult to keep these people alive, because due to the hunger that was more and more pervasive in the city and in the country, most old people died. Almost all the children under 2 years of age died. In the first 2 weeks of 1945, more people died in the city of Rotterdam than in the year 1939. And already 55,000 men were taken away out of the city, so there were already fewer people. There were also no facilities for burial, so people had to take the bodies of their dead, put them on a sled, and bring them to the cemetery and just dump them in a hole, because there was nobody to bury them. There were so many dead people around that the danger of typhoid fever was very real. So the man who ran this house insisted that we all take typhoid fever shots, and that's a series of 3. And after the second one I got real sick, and the doctor didn't want to give me the third one. I had to go home. But before that, something happened. After curfew, it was around 9 o'clock at night, somebody rings the doorbell and they go and check, and it is a female relative of this man who ran the house. We called him the father of the house. I think it was his cousin or his niece or whatever. And she walked in with a German officer. He was a second lieutenant, Obergefreiter. What can you do? We invited him in, put him in the living room, and we sat down, and what can you do? We talked with him. And we asked him what he was doing in the army and so on, and he gave us the most fantastic cock and bull story I've ever heard in my life. He told us that he was born in Kyrgyzia, which is now much better known because it is one of the countries that broke away out of the USSR and is now not part of Russia, but is an independent country in Asia. It's near the Gobi Desert. And he said when he was 10 years old, he left home and he walked, and he landed up in Russia where he grew up, and he joined the army. And his commanding officer had told him to surrender himself to the Germans and to join the German army, where he became an officer so that he could spy for the Russians. And I said to myself, man, I said, if I was in your place, I certainly wouldn't tell that to anybody. I mean, if I was a spy in the German army, I wouldn't tell anybody I was a spy, would you? So I didn't trust this guy. And he had put his pistol on the table, and I asked him to show it to me. For the funny part is that I have a very bad memory of names, but his name I'll never forget. His name was Paul Saripov, and he was a very unusual man. He had hands that were this wide and fingers that were very short. They were much shorter than mine. His hand was almost square like that. And I told him I had never seen a Luger. That, of course, if he believed that, he'll believe anything. After 5 years of war, I certainly had seen my share of weapons. But I figured that if he disarmed that pistol before he gave it to me, he didn't trust me either. And that's what he did. He took all the bullets out before he showed it to me. And sure enough, after the war, we found a report of that evening in the offices of the Grüne Polizei, which is the political police of the German office, and he had made a report of that evening. So he was no Russian, or if he was a Russian, he certainly was a turncoat, and he was an officer in the German army. But I had to go home. I had gotten sick, and my neighbor, my friend's wife, saw me. I was so weak from malnutrition that I walked in between my father and mother, and I was 20 years old, mind you. And she was so shocked when she saw me that she invited me over the next day and gave me a meal. We didn't get many meals. Later on, I did the administration for a church organization, an inter-church organization, which bought or tried to get food from farmers in the country and cook soup for people in the city. And because I did their administration, 3 times a week they gave me a plate of soup, and that's what kept me alive, because I didn't get much more. I got 1 slice of bread a day, and you can't live very long on that. Then in February or in March, the Germans gave permission to the Swedish Red Cross to deliver white bread and butter, and that is the most delicious thing I've ever eaten in my life. When you're so hungry and you get a piece of white bread and a stick of butter, that was wonderful. But the war was fast winding down, of course, and the Germans finally gave permission to the Allies to drop food in designated areas by bomber. And the bombers they used were British bombers in Rotterdam. In Amsterdam they were American bombers. They were Lancaster bombers. And they came in and they dropped foodstuffs from flour and cereal and whatever you have, potatoes, in designated areas of the city. But what people didn't realize is that you drop food in quantity in a city of 700,000 people, that has to be organized and it has to be divided so everybody gets the right portion, and that takes time. But some people didn't realize that whatever food they had, they ate, and then there was no more food until this was distributed, and that took 10 days, and then you died in those 10 days because they had nothing to eat. These are not airplanes. And what I just found out last year, I was in a store in New Jersey, and the man recognized, of course, that I wasn't born in this country. He heard my accent, and we started talking about Holland. And he was a pilot on one of the American planes that dropped food in Amsterdam. And he said that even though the Germans had agreed to let these planes in, and those planes were not armed, they had no bombs on board, they shot 7 of them. He said, I lost 7 crews of these And most of them are 11 and 12 men on those planes. So about 70 people, 80 people lost their lives just delivering food to people who were starving. This brings me to the end of the war. Now, of course, I can go back because there are many stories in between that I do not always remember, but sometimes come back in my mind. But first of all, maybe any of you have some questions.
Would you explain a couple of things Mrs. Schneider told me you had talked about in one of her classes about, explain to the kids exactly why you couldn't use the water closet when you were there, and also, since we studied about Corrie ten Boom, that maybe you would, and Anne Frank's house we've seen, that you could tell us a little bit about those things.
The two things go together. Don't forget, we lived in cities, and most cities have row houses. So my aunt told me that I could not use the bathroom when she was not at home. She said, because in the house next door you can hear that the water is being flushed. And these people might think that there is a burglar in the house because they have seen me leave and nobody is supposed to be in the house. So the risk is great that they might call the police to come catch a burglar, and instead they would catch me and those other Jewish people who were in there. Now about going in hiding places. Well, I tell you, I have not been in Corrie ten Boom's house nor in Anne Frank's house. But I'll tell you of a hiding place that we had in that senior citizen home. If you went up the stairs to the second floor, and on the hall, in the hallway, there was a door. Behind that door was a toilet. Then there was a second door. And behind that door was a huge bathroom. It had a bath, it had a couch, it had a two-person fold-away bed, and that's where these other two boys and I slept. They slept in one bed, I slept on the couch. But you could fold that bed back into the wall, and then take up the rug, and take up the linoleum, and they had cut trapdoors in the floor. And these ceilings in these old houses are very high. The beams are very thick. So, if necessary, you could go in hiding between the floors. And we had a radio in there in which we listened to the London newscast, and we had a typewriter. So every day we made newscasts, which were then printed up and distributed, which of course is an illegal activity. And one day, a whole troop of Germans showed up in front of the house, and we didn't know what they were going to do. But you don't take any chances, so quick as a flash, we got the bed out of the way, and the rug and the linoleum and the trapdoor, and we lay down, the three of us, in between the beams, and they put the typewriter on our stomach and the radio on our stomach, and then they put the trapdoor down and the linoleum down and the rug down and the bed down, and then they stuck a nurse in the bed who was supposedly sick. They figured that if the Germans come in, then at least they wouldn't fold up the bed. And we had holes where the wall meets the ceiling. They had drilled holes in there, and lying in between the floors we could look out front of the house to see what was going on. But these Germans didn't come for us at all. They were there for another purpose. So after we had been there for about an hour, we could get out again. It was not something where we had to be for any length of time. Now, if you have read Anne Frank's book, then you know, of course, that the stairs to the upper story were hidden behind a swing-away bookcase. Now, in Corrie ten Boom's house, they had a room on the second floor which gave access to what they called the annex, which is an upper story in the house next door. But they had access to that, and there was no access from the second house. And they brought in bricks, and her father was a watchmaker. She was a watchmaker, by the way. She was the only licensed watchmaker in Holland. And the underground brought in bricks in grandfather clocks. They carried them in grandfather clocks because you cannot just bring a wheelbarrow of bricks into a house. And they cemented a wall across the floor of that room, and behind a cabinet there were two shelves high, which were a false wall and that could swing away. There was a bed in front of that. And when the Germans raided, all the Jews that were living with them could get in through that trap door and swing it shut, and Betsy ten Voon, Corrie's sister, who had the flu, was in that bed, and everybody was arrested, but they never found the Jews. Corrie, of course, went to concentration camp with Betsy. They were in Mauthausen?
At first they were in.
Yeah, I think they were in Mauthausen. And Betsy died there. Corrie's father died. Her nephew died. Her brother died. And these things happen all the time, you know. I had people in my street who were shot. I had people that I had known who were executed. I have known many people who spent time in concentration camps and fortunately came out again.
When Mr. Steketee was telling you about he wasn't going to stand out like a sheep, part of the story I understand was that there was a call that all young men, do you want to tell the kids about how many thousands in a short amount of time?
55,000 men in 2 days. They picked up and transported. This was the call, this was the order.
That was the one he was showing about, and then all eligible men in Holland had to...
No, in Rotterdam.
In Rotterdam, had to stand outside their front door to be picked up.
Yeah.
And that's when Mr. Steketee was telling you he wasn't going to stand out there like a sheep. But many young men did because there was such fear in the area, and 55,000 were picked up in 2 days.
And also, sometimes they were put under pressure by their neighbors. A wife would say, well, my husband went, why didn't your husband go, you know? And when people get angry and when they feel that they're set upon, they really do things which they normally wouldn't do. So they picked up 55,000 men, and that's a lot of people, I can tell you that.
Chad?
How did your aunt hide all them people in without letting each other know that you guys were there?
By being very smart and being very careful. Like I said, the other people who were there were also not allowed to move around the house. And that German who was quartered in the house, of course, had his own room. And he was told, yeah, well, it's all right that you live here, even though it is forced, but you have no liberty to go through the rest of the house. And he evidently listened to that. We were talking about the Jews. Did I tell you that there were 110,000 Jews in Holland? No, okay. Don't forget, this is my third class today, you know, and I don't know what I have told where. Holland was a country where for many hundreds of years already there was religious freedom. So from the 1600s on, Jewish people from all over Europe came to live in Holland. So we had a very large Jewish population for so small a country. But that never made any difference to us because we had never experienced any discrimination. And these people were not thought of as Jews. They were Dutch. They were your neighbors, period. It made no difference who they were. And of those 110,000, the Germans killed 96,000. And some of them came back out of the concentration camps, so that makes up of some of the 14,000, but about 10,000 people were hidden by other Dutch people to keep them out of the hands of the Germans. My father was involved in that, my father-in-law was involved in that, my aunt was involved in that. And in gratitude, the Jewish people who were saved planted trees in Israel. There was a reforestation program in Israel, and the Jews paid for the trees, and they were given in the name of the people who had rescued them. So we got certificates. I don't have the certificate. I don't know what happened to it. We had a certificate that we had a tree in Israel in our name. So that makes me feel very good.
Isn't that at the Yad Vashem memorial
Yes.
in Israel?
Yeah.
How wonderful.
Yeah.
Tell the students the promise that your father made, or had you make to him about you being in the underground.
Oh yeah, my father was in the underground and I was 18 years old, and being the only boy, I had 3 sisters. My mother was a sickly person. So he made me promise that I would not become active in the underground. He said, I will do what has to be done, but I do not want to give the Germans a real reason to also put you in a concentration camp in case they catch me. And that is one of the most difficult promises that I had to make, and he insisted, and I kept it, even though I knew a lot of what was going on, that I did not become active in the underground. I didn't hide any Sten guns or anything. I'm no hero. I'm just somebody who refused to go to Germany, period. They wanted me there, they would have to catch me, and they didn't. What else was I thinking of now? Yeah, I wanted to tell you that too, that the things that you do and the things that you experience in your teen years, they put a stamp on you for the rest of your life. As the Second World War did on me, on circumstances beyond my control, which forced me to face the fact that I could die in a bombardment, or be shot, or be sent to a concentration camp. And that has colored the rest of my life. I have tried to use my life to help other people and serve other people, which I couldn't do as much as when I had to make a living, but I could do when I retired. So what I mostly do for my church, I visit and with sick people, and I visit in hospitals and try to be of help to people who are in need. And I want you to remember that when you are in your teen years, what you do with your life, the good you do with your life, or the bad you do with your life, is something that colors the rest of your life, and you should be aware of that, and you should remember that. Teen years are very important years, and you may say they're difficult. Yes, they're difficult. I grant you they're not as difficult as mine were. They were different. I didn't have to deal with drugs. I didn't have to deal with alcohol abuse. There was no alcohol. There were no drugs. We had a society that was more black and white. Whatever you did for the Germans was bad. Whatever you did against the Germans was good. So that blurred a lot of lines. Lying was accepted. Stealing was accepted. Sometimes murder was accepted for people who had to be put out of the way. I have been witness to murder myself by Germans, and that is something you don't forget. I'll tell you about that, what happened. We have streetcars in Rotterdam which had sliding doors in the middle. So you have a front compartment and a rear compartment, and the sliding doors are on the side, and there is a rod in the middle that you can hold when you step in. And there were two Navy men standing near that entrance. The streetcar pulls away, and a gentleman comes running, and he jumps on the running board and tries to get in. And these guys, whether they were drunk or whether they want to have some fun, they just loosened his hands from the bar, and they threw him off the streetcar backwards, and he landed on his head and he died. And nobody did a thing. Nobody lifted a finger to punish these guys. So we had no legal protection. We had no civil rights. That's what I wanted to talk about, is the civil rights. That you live in this country where your life is protected by the Bill of Rights. Your life is protected by what the government does. That's why it's important that you know who your government is, that you vote when that's necessary. Because when you live in a society where the top is almighty, so to speak, when you live in a society where evil is the norm of the day, and you can't vote. But in this country you can. In this country you can choose whom you want your government to be, and those things are very important. Does anybody have questions?
I noticed here when your identification paper came by that your birth date is May 8th. And of course, I think about that day with Victory Day.
Yep.
That's probably a very special day on two counts for you.
Oh yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you celebrated your birthday on Victory Day when the war was over in Europe?
Well, we went out in the street and we danced for a couple of weeks, you know. I mean, we were just so happy, and there were street dances, you know. And I did also the wrong things. We went after some of the Nazis. You had girls who had gone out with German soldiers, and they caught them and they cut their hair off. And I was involved in that once, and this happened to be a woman who had 2 children. And we got her out of the house and they cut her hair off. And I felt so sick that I had been part of that I walked away and I never did it again. That's not something I was very proud of. I think it was a good thing because it released some of the pent-up anger. Otherwise, if that had not been released, they might have murdered a lot of people. And that I must say, that even though there was a segment of the population who had cooperated with the Germans or even had been members of the Nazi Party, uniformed members of the Nazi Party, nobody got murdered. And only 2 people, the 2 top people in the Dutch Nazi Party were convicted of treason and executed. Those were the only 2 that were ever executed. So they were very lenient with them.
Now, were they involved in the Nuremberg trials, or were they,
no,
the Dutch government did that?
The Dutch government did that on their own.
Could you tell the kids a little bit about what happened to the Queen during the war and where she went?
The Germans, I just read that. You have a book on that in the library. The Germans dropped paratroops around The Hague in order to catch the government and paralyze the country. And the Dutch army fought so hard that they couldn't get through. So on the 13th of May, which was the day before the surrender, the Queen and the entire government and her family, they boarded a warship and they went to England. The entire cabinet escaped and continued to govern the country as much as they could from England, which was a government in exile. And the Queen stayed in London, and her daughter and children went to Ottawa, Canada. She lived in Ottawa, Canada, and she had a child there. The child was born, and the Canadian government declared the room where that child was born to be Dutch territory, because a member of the royal family had to be born on Dutch territory. So they made a legal decision that that bedroom was Dutch territory. You can do a lot of things if you can change the law, you know. But every year, Queen Juliana, or who is now again princess because she is no longer queen, her daughter is queen, sends, I don't know, thousands of tulip bulbs to Ottawa. Ottawa is always decorated with Dutch tulip bulbs that she pays for because they were so good to her during the war. Oh, I'll tell you something else, and these are sad stories. Those people that I was in hiding with who were at my aunt's house, did I tell you that they lost all these members of their family? No. At the end of the war, the wife and her sister and the 2 husbands, so there were 2 sisters and the 2 husbands, 4 members of the family. Between the 4 of them, they lost 52 members of their family who were murdered, including their 4 grown sons. They had paid large sums of money during the war to an underground organization to take these boys to Switzerland. So as far as they knew, they were safe. They were in Switzerland. And then the war ended, and they found out that this was not an underground organization at all. It was a sham organization set up by the Germans to flush out a lot of Jews, to collect a lot of money, and they shipped those boys to concentration camps and they killed them. We don't even know where they were killed. So here these people had spent large sums of money, had hoped all during the war that they would see their boys again, and they were dead. They went to live in Tel Aviv. They left Holland. They couldn't stand living in Europe anymore. They went to Tel Aviv after Israel became a nation in 1948.
Can you tell us what helped make your decision to come to the United States, to immigrate rather than to stay in Holland?
I don't know. When the war ended, I volunteered for the Dutch Marines to go and fight against the Japs. And because I was a war volunteer, I could write an entrance exam for the officers' school. Since I do not have a college education, the law required that you have a college education in order to be an officer in the Dutch Army, but for war volunteers they would waive that. And I passed that exam. But Japan surrendered in August on account of the bombs in Japan, the atom bombs. And then on the 31st of August, the United States canceled the Lend-Lease Act, by which they had loaned all kinds of facilities and weapons and so on to the Allied government. So all of a sudden the Dutch government had 25,000 Marines, and they had only room and weapons and training facilities for 8,000. So anybody who made a mistake was sent home. And I told them that when I was 12 years old I had pleurisy and pneumonia, so they gave me a medical discharge and they sent me home. And a month later I got a call from the Marines if I wanted to come and talk to them, because the local people in Indonesia had seized the Japanese weapons and they were going to fight the colonial government, which it was, of course, the colonial government of the Netherlands. And the government in power at that time was not going to take that lying down, so they wanted to go fight these guys. So they asked me if I wanted to become a Marine again. I said, yeah, but how about my war volunteer? I passed that officer's entrance exam. They said, the war is over. All the taboos are back on again. If you haven't got a college education, you cannot become an officer. I said, you know what you do? I said, I have a medical discharge. I said, you go fight Sukarno. And I went home. Then I got a job offer from the Royal Oil Company. The name escapes him, Shell Oil it probably was. To go to Indonesia and help them set up their oil fields, because I had learned material knowledge in the shipyard that I could use there. And when they found out that I had a medical discharge from the Marines, they canceled my appointment. They didn't want to send me. So because, which had nothing to do with my health, it was only a technicality. So not only couldn't I become an officer in the Dutch Marines, I also lost the job that I wanted. Then my father was in the United States on a business trip, and he found somebody who wanted to sponsor me, and I accepted that sponsorship. I had an offer to go to the Dutch East Indies, I had an offer to go to South Africa, and I had a possibility to go to Australia, but I chose to go to the United States. So I applied for my visa in January 19... Visa is plural, isn't it? I applied for my visa in January 1946, and I got it in September 1947. That's a long process. By that time, Holland de Markline had asked if I wanted to come to work for them because they were so short on personnel, and my father worked for them. And I really didn't want to do that because I didn't want to work in the same company as my father did. But they insisted, and I agreed to come and work on a temporary basis, that as soon as my visa came through, I would go to the United States. And then, when that visa came through, my boss said, listen, we want somebody in New York. And I have made up 4 names for management to choose from who should go to New York. And you are one of the 4, but I have not told them that you are the only one who has papers to go to the United States, because that's an unfair advantage and you'll never live it down. So yeah, I waited in September and October and November. And finally on the 2nd of December, I was called in and I was chosen anyway, and they said I had to be in New York before the 10th of January, and the last ship to do that was the New Amsterdam, which left on the 2nd of January, and I arrived in Hoboken on the 9th of January, the day before my visa ran out. So here on the 2nd of December, I called my fiancée. I said, we got to get married. And we got to get married before I go to the United States, because that gives you an opportunity to get second preference as an immigrant. And in Holland, you have to get married at City Hall. That's the law. And if you want to go to church after that, that's your business, but you have to get married by the state. So I found out that City Hall was closed on the 1st of January. So the last day we could get married was the 31st of December. So that's what we decided. We got married on the 31st of December because we had no place to stay, we had no furniture, we had no clothes. So I went to the United States and she went back to her mother. And then I found a sponsor for her in New York. And she applied for her papers. And she came in January. And my friends in the company in Rotterdam, they helped a bed for her on 3 different ships because they didn't know when she was going to get her papers. And she ran all to the government offices. And when she finally had her immigration visa, I think she got it on Friday, and on Saturday she sailed. So, yeah, it was pretty good. But I was in New York by myself the first couple of months, so that's not an ideal honeymoon. But I got 4 boys and a girl. I think we made up for lost time. So Bob is not the only son. His other brother, his older brother, lives in Fort Collins also, and he's born on the same day. They have the same birthday. And my oldest son lives in Africa. He's a missionary. My daughter lives in New Jersey, and my youngest son lives in South Carolina. That's why we see so much of the United States, because we travel so much to see our kids, you know.
Where do you live in New Jersey?
As far south as you can go, in Cape May.
Cape May.
Yeah. If you go any further, you fall into the Atlantic Ocean. Yeah. Any more questions?
We've got a few more minutes. Anything come to mind that you want to ask Mr. Steketee?
Yep.
Sam?
Did you have any Jewish friends that got taken away?
Yes, I have Jewish friends. When I worked in New York, I did business with a lot of Jewish people, and some of them became very personal friends. My printer and his wife, they are Jews. And the printer that I worked with when I was a purchasing agent, and we have become personal friends, and we don't live close to each other, but we see each other maybe once or twice a year, and they're very good friends.
I mean, like when you lived in Holland, did you have any?
Yeah, those people that I was in hiding with at the same time, they became part of our family. We called them uncle and aunt, and we loved them as much as we did the rest of our family. Yeah. My father did also other things. The Germans cut off the money to the wives of seamen who were sailing on the Allied fleet, on the commercial fleet, you know. And so he was one of the people who, together with other steamship companies, set up a fund that these wives got paid. So all during the war, these women got paid out of funds that the various steamship companies advanced so that they could live, and he was involved in that.
Chad?
Have you ever been back to Holland to see any?
I've been back 15 times. Because my company sent me to New York, part of the contract was that every 3 years or once every 3 years I could go back free of charge on the ship and have 4 weeks in Holland, which normally you have only 2 weeks vacation. I had 4 weeks in Holland and then 9 or 10 days at sea on going. So that was a great privilege. And all my children have been back to Holland, or to Holland, because they were born here by ship. So I crossed the North Atlantic 15 times and made some cruises in the meantime. And since that time, we've been back by air 8 times. So I've been back 15 times. And I speak the language as well, as easily as I speak English. So I tell them there, of course I don't know the country anymore. I've been away almost 50 years, and countries changed during that time. So I just tell them I'm a foreigner who speaks the country, who speaks the language, and that helps.
John?
Were you scared when all this was going on?
Sometimes I was very interested, because when you're young you don't get scared so easily. I remember there was a minesweeper was lying at the pier next to our office, and the bombers came in, and there were 3 fighter planes that were there to protect these bombers. So they engaged that minesweeper in a firefight, and they had on board what the Americans call pom-poms, and they call them field shoots. They're 4 barrels that are fed automatically out of canisters, and they keep on shooting just like that, 4 of them. And these fighter planes would loop to loop, and they come down and brrrr, and then they go back up again. So I thought that was very interesting, and I figured if I lie with my face in the dirt, I don't see anything, and it doesn't make any difference where you get hit. So I rolled over on my back, and I kept on looking at those airplanes, but I was as black as a Moor from the cordite, because I was lying right next to that ship, and they were shooting those cannon all the time. You get very black from cordite. Cordite is the part of the shell that fires the shell, that sits in the shell, and then of course the bullet goes up. And I thought that was very interesting. And you know as well as I do that if you're interested in something, you don't get scared so easily. But I was more afraid of falling in the hands of the Germans and not being able to stand that. I was not so much afraid of dying, because that was a reality that you lived with. But to get arrested and put in a concentration camp, that was something that I thought was worse than death.
Go ahead, Rick.
Did you know any English when you were in Holland?
Yeah, I went to high school, and in high school in Holland, the requirements are that you learn 3 foreign languages every day. So I had Dutch, English, French, German, 5 days a week, plus algebra, geometry, geography, science, history, art. We had about 13 subjects.
One day?
No, I was in a very good school. They had a very nice system. You had a whole day on Monday and Wednesday and Friday, and you had a half a day on Tuesday, Wednesday and Saturday. So on Monday night you had homework for a half a day, then you had the afternoon off, and you had homework for the whole day. So that's a good system, but you go to school 5.5 days a week.
Could you say something to the kids in Dutch so they can hear the language?
Well, yeah. De Nederlandse taal heeft dezelfde achtergrond als de Duitse taal, maar het is verschillend genoeg om het moeilijk te maken. Duitsers kunnen geen Nederlands spreken en Nederlanders kunnen geen Duits spreken. Does that help?
The Germans don't speak Dutch and the Dutch don't speak German.
Yeah.
You said...
And when I go to Holland, I switch over just as easily. I found out something.
No, I can understand.
I found out something how funny your brain is. Your brain is a marvelous thing. I was sitting at home and I was reading a Dutch book, which I don't do very often, but somebody had given me one, and I was reading that. And the newscast came on the radio, and I kept reading, and I kept listening to the newscast, and I kept reading Dutch and listening to the English newscast at the same time, and both of them made perfect sense. And it's not difficult. Once you know a language as well as your own, it isn't difficult, because you don't think. A table is a table. You don't have to think, well, what is that thing? That's a table, that's a chair. No, I mean, that comes natural. So, language is a funny thing. It's only a means of communication, and as long as the person you communicate with uses the same language system, then you understand each other. That's why when I go to Holland, I have trouble, because when I speak Dutch, they prick up their ears and they say, "Where have you been?" Because I use the language we used in 1948. And if you look at movies in the United States, if you look at American movies, say, of the 30s and the 40s, you realize that that's not the kind of English that you speak.
Like the word gay.
It's different, you know. Not only that, but many other words. So they have fad words. that I don't know. I will ask them, they will say something, and I think I know what they mean. They said, why do you use this word? Why don't you use the
More
other one?
formal, probably.
Then they say, well, we don't use that anymore. We change it.
Mr. Steketee, thank you so much.
Who is the other one? There it is.
You're welcome to keep this sleeve.
Okay,
too. It just
thank you
might-
very much.
It's nice because it's double-sided. You can
Oh,
see
yeah.
both.
Thing ain't stopping.
Man, the one on the hand.